impacts her whole life. Forced pregnancy limits a woman's entire economic future. It takes away her ability to determine the direction of her own life. It forces women to be pregnant and give birth when they don't want to, no matter their individual circumstance. It hurts people in real and irreparable ways. I know after so many decades of precedent, an end to the rights so many women have lived with their entire life seems completely unthinkable. But this is real. This is happening, and Republicans have been preparing for this for decades. We are about to see a tidal wave of abortion bans across the country. So this vote today will force Republicans to face up to the hurt and suffering they have caused and will cause, the lives that hang in the balance. And we all know that if Roe falls, the heaviest burdens will land on those who already face the greatest challenges, mothers who are barely scraping by. It's Black women who already face a severe maternal mortality crisis. It's Indigenous women, especially those on tribal lands, who suffer from violence at unprecedented levels. It is women with disabilities who may already face discrimination in routine medical care. It is women in rural communities who have less resources and are often already forced to drive miles to get the care they need. It's immigrant women, especially undocumented women. And it is our gay and trans neighbors who Republicans never seem to miss an opportunity to scapegoat or bully. People in my state need to know this will impact them too. And many of my colleagues know I'm not one to grandstand or exaggerate the scope of a crisis that comes before the Senate. When I said this was a 5-alarm fire, I meant it. We need to be clear-eyed that this will impact all of us. For one thing, we know the healthcare crises caused by abortion bans, and that's what they are, crises, will stretch across state lines. When Texas passed a law letting people sue strangers for getting or providing an abortion, desperate patients rushed to Oklahoma, only for that state to pass an extreme ban as well, meaning more patients traveling even further with fewer options to get the care they need. And we're seeing this firsthand in my home state of Washington. After Idaho passed a draconian abortion ban of its own, my state had to brace for incoming patients surging into Washington. So there can be no question. If Roe is struck down nationally, if individual states across the country ban the right to abortion, people in every single state will live with the painful consequences of that decision. And they will not forget Republicans are the ones responsible for this. And Madam President, let's also remember, Republicans have been clear, they have been explicit, even that they are not going to stop at Roe, they're not going to stop at the state level, and they're not going to stop at abortion. I can't say this enough. Republicans are already talking about passing a federal ban on abortion. Republicans are already talking about how Griswold, the case that struck down a ban on birth control, might have been wrongly decided. Republicans are already talking about banning IUDs, Plan B. They even held a vote a few weeks ago to undermine our federal family planning program and make it harder for people to get birth control. Madam President, it is clearer than ever that because of Republicans' extremism, not only is the right to abortion at risk, but other important rights are as well. That's why people are so scared, and that's why they are so shocked. Someone back home said to me last week, "What can I tell women in our state so they don't worry?" I said straight up, I'm not telling anyone not to worry. I'm scared and I am frightened for women in this country more than I ever have been before. I'm very fearful, Madam President, but I'm also determined. And I know people across the country do not want to go backwards. They do not want politicians planning their families for them. They do not want politicians forcing people to stay pregnant. They do not want this to be the first generation of women with fewer rights than their mothers. which is why today we are now voting on the Women's Health Protection Act. What this bill does is simple. It follows the Constitution and nearly half a century of precedent and gives the patient the right to get an abortion, no matter where in America that patient or doctor lives. And the question every single senator today is asked is simple as well. Do you trust women? Do you trust patients? Do you trust doctors? Do you believe every American should be able to make deeply personal decisions about pregnancy and parenting according to their own beliefs without government interference? If your answer is yes, then your vote on this bill should be as well. And if your answer is no, if you think women should have fewer rights, if you think it's okay for Republican politicians to force someone else to stay pregnant or give birth when they don't want to, you're going to have to go on the record and let your constituents know you think your personal opinion matters more than their own medical decisions. And you better believe no one will forget this. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
The Senate will be in order. The Senate will be in order. Thank you. Expressions of approval are not allowed by the gallery.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
and I first thank my dear friend and colleague from Washington for her powerful and heartfelt words, and for her leadership as well. Now, Madam President, the question before the Senate is simple. As women's rights face their greatest threat in half a century, will this chamber step into the breach and protect the basic right to choose? Will we enshrine into law what courts have held for decades, that decisions women make about their pregnancies belong to them and them alone? Or will 5 unelected justices presiding without accountability in a courtroom across the street take a fundamental right away from millions and upon millions of women in this country? In a few minutes, it will be time for members to vote. The legislation before this chamber is straightforward. It would codify what Americans already believe, that the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion belongs to women, not elected politicians. It will preserve the safeguard that conservative justices seem ready to strike down in just a few weeks. If they follow through with their decision, the United States, which has always aspired to the expansion of rights, will take a shameful and repressive step backward. Our kids will grow up in a country with fewer rights than those who came before them. This decision, if formalized, can we have order, Madam President?
There'll be order in the Senate. Please take your conversations off the floor.
This decision, if formalized, would be remembered as one of the worst and most damaging cases in the entire history of the Supreme Court. So this is not a theoretical exercise. Oh, no. Protecting the right to choose at this critical moment is one of the most consequential votes we could possibly take. And the American people are watching. The public will not forget which side of the vote senators fall on today. They will not forget who voted to protect their freedoms. And they will not forget those responsible for the greatest backslide of individual liberties in half a century. Across the country, the hard right is hell-bent on sending women's rights back to the Stone Age, and we in the Senate must respond. We must respond to radicals who want to ban abortions as early as 6 weeks before many women know they are pregnant. We must respond to extremists who want to prosecute and imprison women and doctors for carrying out an abortion. And even friends who merely provide rides to clinics could end up in jail. And we must respond to the swell of hard-right ideologues who openly champion restrictions without exceptions for rape or incest. We must oppose the vision that MAGA Republicans clamor for: forced pregnancies, punishment for women and doctors, and 0 exceptions for rape or incest. This is not what America wants. I hope it is not what members of this chamber want either. I implore everyone whose conscience has been jolted over the past week to vote in favor of today's measure. Indeed, I implore everyone who cares about the rights of not just women, but of all Americans, to support this measure. Because if 5 unelected justices are allowed to decide the fates of millions of women, if the rights women have relied upon for 50 years wither away like ash, if we do not take a stand now to protect a woman's right to choose, then mark my words, it will be open season on our God-given freedoms in this great and grand country. Today it will be Roe. Tomorrow it will be a national ban on abortion. And beyond that, something even more dreadful. We cannot allow this shameful backslide to happen. We cannot allow the whims of MAGA Republicans to bully the rest of the country into submission. I urge my colleagues, take a stand. I urge my colleagues and Americans to fight back. I urge Americans and everyone here to defend the right to choose. I urge my colleagues, vote yes. I yield the floor. Call the vote.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. The question is on the Bedoya nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Cardin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hirono, King, Markey, Menendez, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Schumer, Stabenow, Warner, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Cornyn, Fisher, Grassley, Inhofe, Johnson, Lee, Portman, Risch, Browns, Rubio, and Scott of Florida. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye.
Right. You just want.
Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown,
So at least
aye.
the women's health protection.
Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no.
Right in the middle of the pack.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no.
No.
Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no.
So we've got a few more minutes.
Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye.
We knew that.
Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no.
It's a,
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 362, S4132, a bill to protect a person's ability to determine whether to continue or end a pregnancy and to protect a health care provider's ability to provide abortion services, signed by 19 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it in the sense of the Senate to debate on the motion to proceed to S4132, a bill to protect a person's ability to determine whether to continue or end a pregnancy and to protect a health care provider's ability to provide abortion services, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Okay. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crabo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Arono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Cardin, Durbin, Gillibrand, Kane, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Murray, Reed, Schatz, Schumer, Sinema, Smith, Van Hollen, Warren, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Braun, Capito, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Graham, Haggerty, Hawley, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Kennedy, Lummis, Moran, Murkowski, Portman, Romney, Thune, Tillis. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Ms. Collins, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Kelly, aye.
Yeah.
Mr. Sullivan, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Chester, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 865, Julia Ruth Gordon of Maryland, to be an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, signed by 18 senators.
Number 2. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on...
The vote we just took makes crystal clear the contrast between the parties as we approach the midterm elections. Vote, elect more pro-choice Democrats if you want to see a woman have control over her own body. Elect more pro-choice Democrats if you want to protect a woman's freedom and right to choose. Elect more MAGA Republicans if you want to see a nationwide ban on abortion, if you want to see doctors and women arrested, if you want to see no exceptions for rape or incest. We are going to continue to highlight this issue relentlessly and strongly between now and November because it is so important. The contrast is pretty obvious. Elect more MAGA Republicans if you want to see a nationwide abortion ban. Elect more pro-choice Democrats if you want to see the right to choose, a woman's freedom available from one end of the country to the other. Elect more MAGA Republicans if you want no exception for rape or incest. Elect more pro-choice Democrats if you want to see women have the freedom to make decisions over their own bodies. Elect more MAGA Republicans if you want to see a woman forced to carry the results of a rape or incest. Elect more pro-choice Democrats if you want to see women's rights protected. We are going to focus on this issue again and again and again between now and November. We are going to keep fighting and keep fighting and keep fighting until we win. Senator Murray.
Well, I am angry and I'm disappointed, and I am here to tell you that what we saw today is Republicans telling Americans all over this country, and women in particular, that their voice is more important than yours, that what they believe in is more important than your choice about your own body and your own family and your own future. I say to women across America, like me and so many others, now is not the time to back down or sit down. Now is the time to lift up our voices and fight back. And that's exactly what we are going to do. We're going to lift the voices of women and men across this country, show what this decision means to women with an ectopic pregnancy, a woman who's been raped, a woman who is a victim of incest, a woman who is in a vital situation where she and her family and her doctor and her faith should be making that decision. We are not going to let Senate Republicans override women's voices. They may have spoken out today. They may feel they've won today. But women of America, it's time for us to stand up and fight, and that is exactly what we're going to do. Use your voice. We will use our voices. We will fight back, and this goes to the November election. Every one of you has to be willing to stand up and fight with us. We will be your voice. We will fight for you. Stand with us.
Thank you, everybody.
What do you say to Manchin says this goes too far?
Next time, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not. I mean, guys, I'm sorry.
She's the pool reporter. Come on, guys.
Hey,
what's
I'm asking people to move around. When I
Everything? Are we good? All right.
I'm also planning on get low so that you guys can go below me. I'm just gonna stand. I'm sending people notes as I'm holding. That's the problem.
I just asked. I didn't get mad.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Oh my gosh. This time I'm actually probably standing. You want to go left? Yep.
Okay, where are you going?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Right here, right here.
But you're going to be in front.
I'm,
Right. No, I know.
Yeah, yeah.